So good morning, everybody. This is a hot topic on China under Xi. We're going to discuss how much of a threat China is to the US. It's certainly a hot topic at the State Department and in the White House at the moment. Or we're going to look at whether or not it's getting stalled. Now, I've got some expert guests with me, and I'm very proud to introduce Shuai Zhang, CBS News Asia Bureau producer. Now, Shuai is, he's been based in Beijing for a long time with CBS. He's shortly moving to Tokyo, so he's going to get another perspective there, but he will still be responsible for a lot of CBS News's Asia output, including China. And I'm also delighted to have with us Professor Charles Haddad, who is a journalism professor at Stony Brook University and our own in-house expert on China. So welcome, Charles, welcome, Shuai, and I'm very pleased to have you here. I'm going to start with you, Shuai, because President Xi has been in power for some time now. He's on to a historic third term. That's very unusual. He's the first president to have a third term in power since Mao Zedong. So I would love to ask you, just to start with, how is he perceived in China? Is he regarded as a huge success, as a worthy how popular is he, and how many challenges does he face? Good run for a long time, but how is he seen at the moment?
I think it's a tiered issue. If you ask different people from different regions or from different social class, they're going to have different answers. If you ask my friends who will be having a beer with me, I think a lot of people will have a lot of complaints. If you read the stories about educated, affluent Chinese people trying to move abroad, I think that's one part of the opinion. I think it's hard to quantify, like to say who is the majority. If you ask a person, I would say like a Beijinger friend who's, by being a native Beijinger, they have a lot of vested interest. They would like to see everything staying stable. They will say, oh, I think I'm happy with everything as it is. So I think the president is great. If you travel to, like we travel to southwestern China's rural areas, if you ask them, they will have different answers.
True. What do you find, Professor?
It's interesting. I had a conversation with one of my top students who's from Chengdu. And I think she's reflective of a segment that is disillusioned with Xi Jinping. She is doing everything she can not to go home because she sees no future for herself there. And she seems to be reflective of her category, well-educated, middle-class Chinese young people. And I would know if this is still true, but what's being reported in the Western press and what these young Chinese students are telling me, we have a fair number at Stony Brook, is that there's little or no opportunity for them back in China right now. And so that has fueled a growing disillusionment with him. And also, they grew up at a much looser time when you could be more open, and they resent that looseness being taken away. They grew up, or parents grew up in a time when the way that Chinese would put it, when I was over there, the deal is we're out of your personal life now. As long as you don't go on television and denounce the government or organize, we're fine. You can live your life. And the young people that I talk to feel like that deal has been broken, that's no longer true. And because they and their parents lived through a looser time under another regime, and there's a growing resentment about that, coupled with the fact that there's less economic opportunity right now, especially for young people.
So we're looking at an authoritarian regime, of course, and I just wondered, Shuai, how easy it is to be a journalist in China at the moment. We talk a lot about the freedom of the press in America. What's the situation in China?
I think I have been doing this for a decade. I lived through the reverse of the loosening years that Charles mentioned. I think things are getting harder and harder. I can still remember in the beginning of my career, you can just talk to people on the street or send a DM on Weibo, which is Chinese social media, and people will say, "Okay, let's meet up and we can talk about pop culture, politics." And these days, it's very common to ask more than a dozen people. I have all of them saying no. I'm pretty sure you have heard stories about foreign journalists being set up. There are people who are highly, I would say, I'm trying to not use the word brainwashed, but there are people who love their country, would pretend to be a source and feed false information to foreign journalists. And then they post the whole process online to fan this hatred against journalists, which to me this is something I have never witnessed in the past few years. It's more of a recent new development. I think it's harder and harder. There's more hostility. Of course, there's going to be retaliation for your interviewees. That's something that's really making our jobs difficult to do.
I bet. Yeah. You know, I used to go to China, my heyday, about 4 or 5 times a year. And I worked through Shuai University. I taught there, I spoke there, I took American students there and traveled. And I can remember when things change. So when I would take my students there and I would talk to professors there, and Shuai actually at one point invited me to be a visiting professor for a year. We talked about everything. We talked about Tiananmen Square with the students. And one of the things that stuck in my mind about that time period, this is before Xi, this is 2014 or 15 or earlier, and every Chinese student had a Facebook page, had a Google account, even though those things were completely illegal. You weren't supposed to have any of that, but it was all wink, wink, you know, it's okay, you know, as long as you don't brag about it or whatever. And there were 2 groups of students. One group of students setting up servers in the US where they could have their Facebook and Google accounts outside the Chinese system. Another group of students that were watching them. And when they would find the server, it was like, "Oh, you got us." And they shut it down and immediately had another server ready to go. And nobody was punished. It was just, this is a game of cat and mouse. We all know we have to go through this. No big deal. And then about 2015, that began to change abruptly. So when I used to bring the American students over, we would meet with Chinese students and we would have these incredible round robin discussions, all hours of the night, because they're students getting to know each other. And they would talk about anything, including Tiananmen Square. And most of the Chinese students, now we had the cream of the cream, Shuai University, the very top Chinese students from the richest parents, a lot of times with the most access. They all knew about Tiananmen Square and they could talk about it with the American students. And there were no repercussions.
Yeah.
2015, we had the same kind of discussion. The next morning, the chair of the journalism school at Shuai called me into his office, said, you'll recognize this phrase, Shuai, you have deeply offended the Chinese people. This is how they put it. You know, my individual act has offended the whole country and all the people. Why? Because we talked about Tiananmen Square and we offended the Chinese students that were there.
So let me put it to you, Shuai. We're talking about Tiananmen Square just now, but actually there's a live issue right now that's really hitting the airwaves at the moment, which is the origins of COVID-19. Now, the FBI director and also the Department of Energy have come out saying they think it's highly likely that COVID-19 emerged 3 years ago from a lab leak in Wuhan. And indeed, the American ambassador has said there isn't going to be a better relationship with China until there's more honest accounting about the origins of COVID-19. Now, how much of that discussion is being aired in China? And what impact do you think that this controversy will have on US-China relations?
I think for most people on the ground here, we are just pretending the issue doesn't exist anymore. I think that's the strategy for most people because you wouldn't have access to any substantial information to make any judgment or assessment. Asking too many questions could lead to trouble. So I'm just thinking most people, the whole COVID situation leaves many questions unanswered, and people are okay with that because to this day, we still don't know what's the logic behind zero COVID. What's the logic behind the abandoning of the policy, and what's the origin of the virus? There's no transparency. And although there was some symbolic access by foreign media into those labs, and there were interviews, I think, but they don't really have many questions answered.
Right. The WHO has not been allowed in to conduct an independent investigation. Not the US, but the WHO, the United Nations Independent Observer, has not been allowed in to conduct basically an investigation for the world. With epidemiologists from all over the world, including Chinese, have not been allowed into.
Yeah, although the WHO's findings that originally that it was likely to, to come from a wet market in Wuhan, keep being repeated by the Chinese government, don't they?
Yeah.
They like to cite the WHO.
The Chinese government announced, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that they've moved on. Basically, they've signaled we've moved on. The message now is being trumpeted that this was the greatest success in the world in dealing with COVID, and that's the only thing that can be discussed is what a fantastic job that we've done. They're shutting down any dissent on WeChat or Weibo about it, and signaling that if you contradict that message, as Shuai said, there's going to be trouble.
And Shuai, the Chinese government has sort of said, okay, we're over COVID-19 now, it's sort of finished. But the zero COVID policy led to incredible riots and protests of the like one rarely sees in mainland China. Did the regime panic? And what do people think now that that policy of severe lockdown is over? Do they just scratch their heads and wonder privately what that was all about? Did the government overreact, or was it necessary to save lives?
I think there are two types of like everyday ordinary people. One is that I will listen to whatever the government tells me. I think the other kind, of which is the thinking type, has always had a lot of complaints and doubt about zero COVID from the beginning. I think we're happy to see that go, but it's really interesting to see in a WeChat group that's filled with my neighbors. A lot of senior citizens are still complaining about the lifting of the zero COVID policy. They think they're gonna die because it's at least 2 years of propaganda. You think you catch COVID, you die. And America has done a terrible job. And those people will think, oh, I don't want to die. Why would you give it up?
Interesting.
And what about the economics of China?
Like a lot of issues in China, people have highly different opinions.
Yeah.
So the economics of COVID had very serious consequences, though, didn't it? And the Chinese economy was really faltering as a result. I mean, we've just had some figures suggesting that growth is beginning to resume again. But how damaging has COVID-19 been for China?
I think there are a lot of theories, but I still think the key factor that lead to the lifting of zero COVID is the economy, because they couldn't live the faltering economy anymore, because zero COVID itself costs so much tax revenues, and if you keep that in place, you have no tax because all the businesses are going out of business. If you walk on Beijing street, like there's a Starbucks, there's a Subway restaurant, that they're all empty. I think that was one of the key factors. I still don't think the protests are why they changed their direction.
Yeah, I think there's a big question here that they're not dealing with at all, and that we're struggling with, and that is long COVID. So how many people have it and have been disabled by it, and what effect is that going to have on the workforce? So China's at a crossroad right now. It's no longer, they no longer can count on cheap labor to drive the economy. They have to move up the ladder. The property market is stalled out. The decline is starting to soften, but it's still stalled out from where it was. And that really affects how Chinese people feel about their country and their prospects. What's going on with the apartments they own, what's the trajectory of real estate. And if there's not a good medical social safety net in China for people. So if you have, America has 500,000 people so injured by COVID that they're disabled. If even that number alone is in China, and they're not going to have the access to healthcare that we have in the West, what kind of impact is that going to have on the economy, both in terms of those able to work and those able to spend? I think that's a big question mark that they're not addressing, and I'm really curious about it.
I think we just don't have any real assessments on that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to really rely on anecdotal evidence. We don't know how many people died, how many people have long COVID, and it's not even a new issue because all of those.
That's
back
right.
in the days when we have a little bit of press freedom, we hear about stories from those long SARS patients who lost their jobs, were maybe still struggling to today. But I think we don't really hear from long COVID patients.
It's had a huge impact. It's continuing to have a huge impact on the U.S. and the U.S. labor market. I have to assume it's going to be similar in China. We just don't know. They're just ignoring it. We just don't know.
I mean, if you look at things in a very cynical way, China could argue we have so many people. We don't care if some are
but they don't anymore. The next generation.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I know the demographic cliff is another issue, but at this point, they could say we still have many people at this point, and if some people died, we can go back to work.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually about the demographic cliff, because one of the things that people are scratching their heads about over here is that China, having long insisted that people should only have one child, is now desperately trying to raise the population so that it doesn't have an overpreponderance in future of elderly people dependent on a smaller, shrinking workforce of young people. How much thought is being given to that at the moment in China?
I think most young people would joke, we want to stop contributing to the pension fund because we will never get our money back. It's being spent right now on the senior citizens that need their pensions now. I don't think there will be any left when millennials or Gen Z grow old.
Yeah, I think this is part of, she faces a coming together of several huge issues that are new in modern Chinese times. He's really at a critical moment in terms of the economy has to switch gears. You have a change, a dramatic change in the demographics going forward. Not only are there fewer people, but the young people they become modern, Western. They don't want to have children, or at least they don't want to have children early in life. Their first, my brain is surveying all the Chinese young women that I have as students. Not a single one of them talks about getting married or having children. It's not on their agenda, at least not for, in their words, like a decade. So that's huge.
What do you make of that, Shuai?
I think it's what they call voting with your body, because as I said, it's very hard to quantify public opinion in China. There's no, if you ask people do you support a government, you will never get an honest answer. But I think the fact that no one wants to have kids says a lot about their assessment or their judgment about the future of this country.
Yeah, it's not just China, it's in the West as well. I think, young people feel very challenged about their futures. They can't get on the housing market. They can't get the jobs they want. They don't feel they can have the prosperity that their parents have. Now, that might be slightly different in China, where you get rising prosperity across the generations.
But will it, that's the big issue. Can she continue the engine? So if you talk to, and I'd be very interested in Shuai's perception of this, but when I was there and we talked to older people or middle-class people, and nobody supported the Communist Party. They tolerated it because there was a deal. As long as you can guarantee that my children will do better than me and that you can maintain civil peace, I'll look the other way. I'll tolerate you. I just accept it as a part of, will that deal be threatened? That is the sort of unspoken deal that the Chinese people have with the Communist Party. We'll tolerate you as long as these two conditions are factors gathering that are threatening that bargain, that unspoken bargain that the people have with the party.
I think those theories make sense to a certain level, but I just don't think the government necessarily has a deal with the people, because it's not a democratic system. We have no leverage. We could be mad about the deal or the deal not working anymore. What can you do?
And how much knowledge does Chinese people have about current foreign policy of Xi's government, which is causing a lot of tension with the US? Obviously, at the moment, China's being very supportive of Russia and Ukraine. They have come up with a so-called peace plan, but the US are dismissing that as very one-sided and very sort of pro-Russian plan. And of course, there's the huge issue of Taiwan and the reunification of Taiwan, two very different issues. So let's just start at the moment with the Ukraine war and China's very good relations at the moment, seemingly, with Vladimir Putin. And then we'll go on to Taiwan. Shuai, what do you make of that?
To me, I have been trying to figure out exactly what they're doing with foreign policy. And I think they're as clueless as we are, like observers, ordinary people. There hasn't been really a clear, intelligent strategy. For me, I think China probably didn't even know Russia will invade, and now it's stuck in the middle. And this so-called peace plan doesn't really have positive feedback from anyone.
China and Russia, what we now call China and Russia, have a long and tortured history. So the idea that somehow they're going to be best buddies forever, they weren't best buddies when they were both solidly Stalinist communist countries. it wasn't that long ago they have fought a border war. I know from being in Russia, the Russians are deeply worried about China, especially in the east where Russia's emptying out and Chinese are actively moving into these parts of Russia that are emptying out for economic opportunity. I think it's fragile and fraught, given its history and the tensions between the two. Basically, Russia would have to play second fiddle. China's economy is so much bigger, so much more important than Russia's, that they don't have much negotiating leverage with China. And the Russians are deeply worried about China within their, I haven't been there in a while and talked to people, but within the government, and I was there when Putin was there, they were deeply worried about China, despite all the talk, we're best friends, we share, blah, blah, blah. But within the bureaucracy of Russia, they're deeply worried about China and China's rise.
And do you think
I think they should be worried because
exactly, smart.
From China's side, I think the thinking here is very calculating and
exactly
Machiavellian. I think the next minute China thinks it might benefit more by betraying Russia. It could do it any minute. I don't think it's a stable,
look at it.
Alliance.
Yeah, I agree. Who would you rather have as your partner, Germany or Russia? Before, China was very close to Germany. All of its infrastructure, most of its infrastructure, German technology, German engineering. Who's a better partner? Who would you want to hitch your wagon to? A failing state like Russia or the Germans? So I think Shuai is exactly right. It's just totally Machiavellian for the moment. Can we embarrass the Americans? How will this play in what we used to call the third world? I think they'll switch on a dime. And I think the Russians know this, that they can't be counted.
There's something else going on as well, because obviously Russia hasn't had the easy win in Ukraine that it was hoping for. How do you think Xi has reacted to that? And how do you think that impacts on China's longstanding desire, and the sort of drumbeat seem to be growing larger at the moment, to sort of to reunify with Taiwan?
I will agree with all those reporting from print media that we have seen that this is a lesson for China. I think it's definitely thinking twice before taking actions.
I mean, it thought presumably that it could, it could really start to encircle Taiwan and take it over pretty much in the near future, would you have said?
Probably not in the near future. But I just think of a really interesting angle, which is I think there's a reporting that Putin made the wrong mistakes because he was getting bad information. Like his information diet is not diverse. He says he's only told him what he wants to hear. I think I'm just worried if that happens in China, the president here will make the same mistake. He will. I think a lot of people are guessing, and I kind of agree that he has no idea of what's really happening on the ground.
Yeah, I think the one advantage that the Chinese do have, say, over the West and us is they play for the long game. So they are winning the game on the ground with their people that Taiwan is part of China. And I think as long as they can maintain that perception among the Chinese people, at least the Dalu, that might be good enough for now. But there's one big important player here that's never discussed that is critical, and that is Japan. Japan would see, their people have said, Taiwan is a tripwire. We will not permit the Chinese to control Taiwan. And so they're rearming. Every time the Chinese ramp up the rhetoric on this, gives more clout to the hawks in Japan. and they're slowly but steadily rearming, and they see Taiwan as a no-go zone. It's not just about us and China. The Japanese are a huge player here and what they would do about it.
Yeah.
Well, you're in a perfect position to answer that, Shuai, because you're about to move to Tokyo. What about the geopolitics of the region?
I'm just thinking China is giving Japan really good reasons to change their policies. I think constitution too, to become. I'm not sure if normalized is the correct word, but they will normalize to arm themselves more aggressively. I think China's aggressiveness is making things easier for them to
exactly. And the last thing you would think the last thing in the world the Chinese would want, and the world in general, is a remilitarized Japan. That's like putting a gun to your head. So you have to separate the rhetoric, the public rhetoric of the Communist Party for what's being thought and decided inside the party. I have to assume, having talked to, this long time ago, people who were involved in the forming of that policy, that they well knew that Taiwan is a tripwire for Japan and that they have to manage that well. It's also a tripwire for Korea. But Japan is the real, the Chinese used to say when I was there, if there's a third world war, it'll be in the South China Sea. And this is Chinese saying this, 10 years ago. So they used to be well aware of it, but who knows now with Xi, has that calculation changed? I have no idea.
So I've just had a comment coming in from somebody called Matthew Trainer, hello, saying Japan will have to nuke up, given the situation. That might be a bit extreme. What do you think, Shuai?
Maybe they need to. I'm just thinking we shouldn't underestimate China's assertiveness.
Yeah, I mean, great powers have always made colossal blunders. We're witnessing one right now. The other factor here is one of the reasons the Japanese are rearming is because the U.S. is pulling out of the deal that it made with them after World War II. Don't rearm. We'll be your umbrella. Don't worry. We will protect you in the South China Sea. But for 20 years now, we've been slowly but surely. It wasn't just Trump. Trump voiced it, but the U.S. has slowly been pulling out of that deal and actually asking the Japanese to assume more of the responsibility for their military umbrella. And then imagine this. If this was happening in the U.S. or any other country, the Japanese have they protested, but they have done nothing while the North Koreans are firing missiles over their territory. What other country in the world would tolerate that? Imagine the effect that has on the policymakers in Japan, on the population, and China has done nothing about it. It's been unable to restrain its ally, North Korea, from doing this.
Yeah, I think you're going to have a really fascinating time in Tokyo, Shuai, because of these really interesting issues, and you're going to understand them so much better as well with your experience in Beijing. But I'm going to be wrapping up soon, but I really want to ask you about US relations. I mean, when you started reporting in the Beijing Bureau, US and China were really pretty, they were quite open. They were engaging with each other. Now the atmosphere is really getting more and more hostile and suspicious. What do you think is going to be the impact of that? These very difficult issues. We just had a spy balloon, causing all kinds of a sort of farrago over here in America. How do you see US-Chinese relations developing? And if not for the good, how serious is that for the security of the world?
To me, I mean, This is my personal take. I think decoupling is the ultimate result or outcome, because you can just feel the two countries drifting apart in your daily life. It's harder to access or even purchase anything that's American. Nobody's really putting it on the front page of a newspaper, but you can feel it's harder and harder to connect with each other.
That's very interesting, because our economies on every level are so entwined. China cannot prosper without the United States and vice versa.
But it has been developing links, hasn't it, through the Belt and Roads Initiative with so many other countries. I mean, some people say imperialism, colonialism,
what, other than Germany, United States, or Western Europe in general, without those markets, how can the Chinese economy prosper? If you're going to drive away the US and the Germans, and now we're going to be friends with the Russians, how can you possibly have the growth that you've had over the last 30, 40 years without them, without their investment and without their consumers? That's
I think they're trying to look for alternatives like Iran, North Korea, Russia.
They are,
but much less ideal alliance. But
if you added all those, I'm just talking about the business side. If you added all their consumers together, they maybe would equal Arizona. So, and plus, I don't know if this is true anymore, but one time China held the greatest reserve of U.S. currency. And
they probably
sold off a lot of that in the last couple of years. I have seen no publicity about it, but we're joined in so many ways. Plus, this whole thing about this balloon it's hard to take seriously, in the sense that, well, it's okay for us to spy on the Chinese. Maybe we're not using balloons, but we knew they were going to talk about selling weapons.
But
okay for them. I mean, this is just
it's just an example of growing hysteria, isn't there? About U.S.-Chinese relations.
Has nothing to do with what's real and what's going on. And the diplomats know this. China has great. I mean, they stole every single employment data of every single federal employee years ago. No hue and cry. Some pissant balloon flying over the U.S., which they easily shot down, and we're ready to go to war. It's hard to see what's real in all that.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is how politicians utilize those moments. It doesn't really matter. I think substantially, but when you make it public, it's on the loop on cable news. I think that actually makes people.
It's just a prop. It's a prop, an entertainment prop. The other thing is,
Charlie, we're going to be running out of time soon, so I'd just like to stop on that thought of the entertainment prop and move to one sort of last question, really bringing it back to President Xi and the Chinese future under Xi. He has pretty much made it clear he's president for life. Do you anticipate him staying in power right to the end of his days? Is the US going to have to live with this very authoritarian and much more, inimical China as regards US relations?
I think it's very hard to say. I wish I knew how long he will stay.
You would have to start.
A lot of people would joke his daughter, who's educated in America, might be the successor one day, but we don't really have any evidence for that.
Oh, so he is building a dynasty if he can, you think?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure all those, I'm not sure if it's accurate reporting or it's just gossip. I think his daughters went back to America during the pandemic to study.
Well, I can remember some journalists got expelled from China for reporting on the red princes that were doing so well.
The princeling.
In another regime, under another,
Yeah.
not so long ago. So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out, whether we're witnessing the rise of a Xi dynasty, or whether the kind of protests that we saw on the streets not so long ago could actually knock things sideways. I have to say, you're in a fascinating region. You looking forward to your move to Tokyo?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna miss covering China because I'm very old-fashioned. I think on-the-ground reporting is very important. I know a lot of journalists who couldn't get a visa or for other reasons are covering the country remotely and trying to do a good job. I think it's important to see with your eyes. Like a few weeks ago, we traveled to rural China to see the so-called homecoming wave. Will migrant workers carry the virus back to their hometown? It never happened, unlike the experts who forecast them, because Omicron is so strong, it just traveled back before the workers go back home. So I think it's the responsible thing to do for journalists is to see things with your eyes and debunk those theories.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's such an important message for all our journalism students here at Stony Brook University. You can't beat seeing things on the ground, no matter how well informed you can think you are at a distance. Anyway, thank you so much for participating. So just to wrap up, thank you, Shuai Zhang, CBS news producer for Beijing, soon to be moving to Tokyo and still responsible for the Asia Bureau, and also Professor Charles Haddad, our very own journalism professor and China expert here at Stony Brook University. Thanks for joining us for this hot topic. It's been a pleasure to have you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.